I will start by saying welcome to this session of March Monday modules. We're doing place, policy, and type 2 diabetes, which is considered an extension lesson from the homeostasis, biology, homeostasis, and type 2 diabetes. And I will share my screen here to show you the workbook and to show. This is our overview site, and to find this lesson, if you go to our Google site and scroll down to the bottom, you can find this lesson here. This one doesn't have a website component, but it uses there's a whole Google folder of things, and the main thing that you would want is the teacher map that looks like this. And it is has hyperlinks to everything we're going to do today.
One of the things with this lesson that both Joan and I have found really useful is to kind of set the tone for the learning space, because some of the things that are covered or tackled in this can be kind of triggering for people, or people are coming at this from a lot of different backgrounds. So whenever I'm kind of holding a space for learning, I like to kind of make it very intentional about what it is that we're doing today. So this is intended to be a safe space for learning. It is encouraged that everyone participate with sensitivity to the fact that we all fall along a spectrum of experience and understanding with a given topic. Today's topic is going to have a lot of different pieces to it. And so this is a place for us to be open with our ignorance and compassionate to the ignorance and biases of others. You may hear questions or comments that make you feel uncomfortable, but we're going to do our best to intervene if anybody says anything that's like out of lines, hurtful, or insensitive. But we really want to create a space for compassion and understanding, recognizing that we all have more to learn about any of these given subjects. So we just want to be able to engage openly, honestly, and with compassion in the space. And does anybody have any questions about kind of the intentions here? And as we dive into it, you'll see some of the aspects of why we're setting the intentions for the space.
Do you have, you're not sharing your screen right now, so do you have the statement that you just made somewhere for us to be able to access?
I can copy that over for sure. This is one that I use for, in the department, we have DEI symposium, and that they're discussion places where we really need to set that tone, because sometimes people will say, say things that, it's not intended to cause harm or to make people feel uncomfortable, but, we want to make the space for people to be open so that they don't withdraw from the space and not engage. And I'm sure you all are experts of your own classroom, and you'll know what kind of comments students might make based on some of the information materials that we're putting out there in this lesson. And we've had some really great conversations with teachers about how to teach it. People have given each other feedback on like best practices. We had a really great session at, I believe I get NSTA and NABT mixed up, but I can't remember which one it was in Chicago. We had this really great session where we talked about how to talk about these issues in the classroom. So we'll get into the content and you'll see what we're talking about on this. And I'll pass it back to Joan.
So what we're going to do today grew out of my own personal striving to make sense of data that looks like this. And you see this not just for diabetes, but for cancer rates, for basically any large complex disease or condition. You can see it broken down into rates for different ethnic groups. And so this, coupled with the fact that a lot of people think that biology determines your racial identity and your racial identity is determined your biology, I think this gets really sort of misinterpreted as, well, if you are American Indian or Alaskan Native, then you have higher rates of diagnosed diabetes because of your ethnicity which is true, but then that tends to, we answer that with genetic answers, which are not true necessarily. And so this lesson starts with showing this information without asking students to really weigh in, because we want to prime them to be thinking about this, but we don't want to drive things that are, we don't want to drive misconceptions. So it really starts with like, look at this, what do you think of this? Do you think this is due mostly to environmental factors or genetic factors? Having them weigh in on this, no discussion, and then we move on to the lesson. So that's pretty much what we're going to do today. So our grant is actually called Genes, the Environment, and Me. That's what all of this curriculum development has grown out of. And so we think of genes as those things like DNA and ancestry and you know, the things that get passed on through people and genes in your family. The environment is also hugely important, and as I mentioned in a couple of weeks ago, and we've talked about, we really want to expand the definition of what the environment is beyond you know, the pH and the temperature sort of things. That the environment is huge, and all of these things play a part in our environment, people's histories, their privilege, their politics, the resources, histories of discrimination, etc. And then what this lesson also gets into is how policy can drive some of these environmental differences and make a difference for people. So as far as NGSS goes, there's no one performance expectation that aligns exactly with this lesson, but I want to point out that students are actually working on understanding things like stability and change, and analyzing and interpreting data, and constructing explanations and designing solutions along the way. So there are ways to tie this in. What we're going to do today is look at some data in two probably somewhat small breakout groups. We're going to watch 2 short video clips. We are going to talk about a timeline of events that are discussed in the video clips. Many of you have already done the environmental access and choices survey, so we probably won't spend too much time doing that. And then I would like to spend the bulk of the time talking about how we frame the interrelationship between access and choice and policy, and then talking about how race gets tied to health outcomes and how we talk about that in our classes. So this lesson has some goals, and here they are. I will just give you a second to read those. And we'll move on. So this lesson dives into the telling of a story about the Pima Indian, which you may be familiar with. It's a story that's been told a lot because the Pima Indian have the highest rates of diabetes at one point in the world, I believe. So the Pima Indian is what the people are referred to in the study itself. Their preferred name is the Acamel Otham people. So you will hear that in the videos, and I will refer to them that way, also known as the river people. So we are going to break out into groups right now. And if you have your workbook open, you should see a picture of this so that maybe you can be looking at it while we go into breakout groups. But really, I would like for you to think about, before we see the data, what you think this will look like. So, and you would do this with your students. So make sure that students would understand what the X and the Y axes are. And what this will show is the diabetes incidence in 3 different populations. And our 3 populations are non-Pima Mexicans, Pima people living south of the border in Mexico, so Mexican Pimas, and then Pima people living north of the border in the United States. And so really what we're looking for is trying to figure out, will the rates of diabetes be more similar for people who live in the same geographical region, the same area like in Mexico or the United States, or will they be more similar for people who have the same ancestry, a shared ancestry background, which one would think of sort of a biology genetics. So There we go. Let's join those rooms. All right, so now that students have had a chance to actually look at the data and think about environment versus genetics, and which seems to be the biggest determiner of outcomes, then now we're going to hear the story. So we're, how this happened and what is the story behind this. And this has been very well documented with the Atham people in the Southwest United States and Northern Mexico. And so the next part is that we're going to watch a couple of video clips. So once again, I will share my screen and we will watch those. Any questions so far about the data or how to work with this with your students? Okay, let's move on.
There's a lot of debate and conversation currently looking at the role of genetics and environment in the problem that we see with diabetes in American Indian communities. So, for example, diabetes was exceedingly rare prior to damming the rivers in Arizona. There was actually a fairly complete health survey done right around the early 1900s. And what they found was one documented case of diabetes among Southwestern tribes. So it was not a common health problem historically when people lived in a different environment and had different lifestyles. Then what we saw was damming the rivers in the 1920s and 1930s. And then by the 1970s, some of the local tribes had the highest rate of diabetes in the world. So we did not see a tremendous genetic shift between 1900 and 1970. What we saw was a tremendous change in environment and lifestyle. So when we look at the allocation of resources, again, looking at this from a policy perspective, we will work with some communities and spend many, many millions of dollars on genetics research in those populations. And at the same time, we won't spend $40,000 for a PE teacher. So we haven't prioritized the allocation of resources to reflect the needs of the communities. We've allocated resources to reflect the needs of policymakers and the medical research community. And this really is a social injustice. But looking at it from a broader perspective, we're seeing an explosion of type 2 diabetes around the world. It's not just American Indians. It's not just in this country, but in the whole world, in developing populations. What we've seen is a tremendous change in diet and processed foods and things like corn syrup, which makes the availability of sugar that much greater in processed foods. And as a result, we're seeing a tremendous increase of diabetes throughout the world. And that certainly is not genetic. The world has plenty of healthy food, we just don't distribute it equally. And the people who do not have access to healthier choices are the people and the populations that are suffering the most from diabetes.
All right, and then for the second clip.
Pima's lived a very, very difficult life at the bottom of the economic scale. We had almost no recourse except to become dependent upon governmental benefits.
Shortly after the dams were built, the U.S. military began distributing free commodity foods to Native Americans.
And it definitely brought us through the hard times. This is the commodities building, where they host the commodity food. This is where people used to come get their cheese, their beans, and their grape juice and stuff. There used to be just rows and rows and rows and rows of those.
But this surplus food, white flour, cheese, refined sugar, lard, canned foods, is a diabetic's nightmare, as it was for Terrell's neighbor.
They asked her how many people in her household, and she said about 5. And the guy said, well, you can get 5 boxes of food. And there was chips and candy and canned food. And I thought, well, that's an idea. It's a nice idea about having food, but it's just the wrong kind of food. And I asked her, I said, so what kind of, like, were there any kind of normal food? She goes, well, there were cans of gravy.
It It was not until 1996 that fresh produce was offered in the program, and authentic traditional foods are still not included.
When we think of traditional American Indian food, for example, fry bread is one of the things that comes to mind. Well, in truth, tribes did not have fried bread historically. The roots of fry bread are in the commodity food program. And fry bread is essentially trying to do the best that you can with your commodities, flour, lard, and vegetable shortening. Over generations, when people grow up with that, it becomes a part of the culture. It becomes acculturated into the community that is part of the norm.
There is only one small market on the 581 square mile Gila River Reservation with a small produce section. A regular supermarket is an hour's round-trip drive.
If you're in an impoverished community and you don't have healthy choices for food and you don't have safe places to exercise, you're tremendously disempowered when it comes to a disease like diabetes. And that has nothing to do with how much medication is in the pharmacy. It has everything to do with social determinants of health, which include that sense of control, that sense of self-empowerment that is important to all of us, whether we're Native or non-Native. It has an impact on self-identity, and it has an impact on one's sense of hope for the future.
All right, so that's the storyline that students hear, and if you're watching that and thinking about some of the historical, the markers in history, well, let me just say, students construct a timeline given this information and some other websites that they can go to look for some more information. But what are some of the historical pieces that that happened along the way to the Acham folks, the people? Normal, I would say with students, you start, teach art, and as you're watching the video, you'd be writing, the dates and things that happen. But what are just some things that happened that you just saw?
Well, they started to dam the rivers.
Absolutely. So the 30s and the 40s, the rivers started getting dammed. What else happened along the way?
Well, once they dammed the rivers, then they had to give them, they felt the commodities, which were, yeah, and not the fresh. I didn't realize the fresh fruits and vegetables didn't come in until 1996. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those commodities, it was boxes of leftover foods. It wasn't right. It was not planned for nutrition for a community. It was leftover cans and stuff, non-perishable.
Yeah. So you see a real driver of the problem is being rooted in the commodities, the food commodities that the folks were given after their entire way of life was destroyed by the damming of the rivers. I mean, that was how they got their food. They traded food. It was a big part of the lifestyle, and that was just wiped out. So from this point, students would create a timeline of these events, and I'll show you how. There are a couple ways to do this. Assuming you're all back in the classroom, in the resource section, there are some strips of paper with the dates, and you can cut the dates off and have them just sort of order them and figure out what order they think things happened in. It's fun to do a scratch off sticker so they can have the big reveal by scratching off the date and see how well they did as far as ordering certain events. If you are online still, then there's a way of doing this. Again, I'm gonna share my screen here. Using this template, which is a screen. This is a picture of it, but these all move, and so students can write things and then move them around so that they're constructing basically a timeline that looks something like this, that talks about starting with, for centuries, people living along the Gila River grew corn, beans, squash, cotton, tobacco using intricate systems of irrigation, and then you see what all happens. The video didn't go into this, but there's some additional information that talks about all the settlers coming through and settling, Arizona becoming a territory, Arizona eventually becoming a state. In 1902, there was one case of diabetes, and then towards in the 40s and in the 70s, they have some of the highest rates in the world. It's also important to talk about current day that the community now operates farms and agricultural projects. There are golf courses and resorts and casinos and an amusement park. I mean, the community has weathered this in important ways, and not to leave students with sort of a feeling of like there's of hopelessness of these things happen and there's no hope, although it is a difficult story. So from here, the conversation becomes about access and choice, and how in this storyline, if you have access to lard and flour, and that's pretty much it, your choices are to make things like fry bread. And it was news to me that fry bread was not really a traditional native dish, because that's how it's presented, but that's what you do with food from your commodities market. And so if you only can make choices about things that you have access to, things that you have access to are really within the realm of policy. So then if we're talking about policy, we're defining that as laws, regulations, procedures, administrative actions implemented by governments and other institutions. But then to bring this back to the Akimel O'odham people, thinking about the timeline of events and which of these things was driven by policy, which means that it didn't just happen automatically, naturally, that there were decisions made by people that impacted the lives of the river people. And so if you go back to the timeline and pull out some of the things that were driven by policy, then you start to see how policy can drive access for people, which can also drive their choices. So Arizona didn't just become a US territory without any policymaking. The dams did not just happen by themselves, that was a decision made that benefited some people and really hurt other people. So then the idea is to think about how might life be different for the Pima people living in Mexico and then across the border in the United States. And once you have an understanding of the history of the people and what had happened to them, you can see how this graph makes some more sense. It's also, I think, important to talk about how people are defined as Pima in the study, because it's actually part of a linguistic group. It's not any sort of genealogical DNA-based study where people looked at DNA and said, oh, well, you're Pima or you're not. It's a linguistic group, and they determined it based on a 1994 census where you were either full Pima, part Pima, or considered no Pima at all. So also pointing out that deciding whether this person, whether you're Pima or not, or the idea of race, it's encompassing a constantly changing social categories. And there's a lot of diversity within that group, that the Pima people are not a monolith, that there's a lot of diversity within this group that has been designated a racial or ancestry group. So again, policy influencing access, which influences choice. And I just want to say that there are feedback loops that happen within this, because your choice can also affect your access. So if if a Walmart comes to town and everybody starts shopping at the Walmart instead of the mom and pop place, then pretty soon the mom and pop place goes out of business, and then the only access that you have is to Walmart, because that's your choices have driven that. All right, I'm going to. Any thoughts or questions about the choice and access and the presentation of the policy portion? I want to back up something I said at the beginning is one of the reasons this lesson was written is because a lot of teachers use type 2 diabetes, or more specifically, they use glucagon and insulin to talk about feedback mechanisms and homeostasis. And they go, you know, you eat something, your insulin is released, your blood sugar goes down, glucagon is released, but they never, that's usually the end of the story once students have been told about homeostasis and they learn that. And so the idea is that this lesson is really looking into a much more diverse reasons as to why people become diabetic. It's not just poor blood glucose homeostasis, that there are a lot of external systems that are in place that are impacting different groups of people differently. The next part is to do the environmental risk. I would like to show, or if you have the workbook in front of you, you should have the link. And I'd like for you just to click on it. Raise your hand if you've already done this already. I feel like most of you. And okay, if you haven't done it, please click on it and maybe cycle through the first couple. But this is an impactful time for students to also think about their own environmental risks. So we're not just talking about those people over there that are impacted in that way, but this is something that lots of students also, everybody has an environmental risk score. We maybe have not been impacted by the same sorts of policies, but just the idea of fast food, you know, how many fast food restaurants are in your neighborhood tell you something about your environment.
And I think it's interesting too that a lot of these environmental risk factors that are covered in that survey are also related to policies that get put in place. And so each of the questions has a little data snippet to back up the statement or the risk factor that's generated. And you know, that kind of feedback and feed forward loop goes between choices and access, but also choices and policy and, you know, access. And I think the survey does a pretty good job of tackling those pieces there.
So in the survey, when students are asked how many fast food restaurants are in your neighborhood or your direct environment, they're also asked how often do you eat at a fast food restaurant. So we're trying to tackle the idea of access and choice. So you may or may not have access to fresh farmers market food. You may not have access to fast food stores, and that's going to impact your choice. One of the questions, does your neighborhood have parks and trails and skate parks and places that you can be physically active in a safe way? But then how often do you go to those places and are you physically active?
I have a question about the form. Is it possible to still have access? Wasn't there like a paper document version of it before it was is it still possible to have access to that?
Yes. So the paper version, that's a great question. I can add it to this lesson. The paper version is in lesson 4 of the biology homeostasis in the foundational unit. So do you know where to find it?
I think what I like about it, yeah, I think I can get back in there. I think what I like about it is that without the sort of little data snippets in between each question, it almost feels like it's not sort of like leading them to answer in a certain way, because I feel like they're afraid that they're gonna, okay, if I say I eat too much fast food, then it's gonna tell me that now I'm on the road towards obesity or something like that, you know. And so if I don't, I feel like having it on paper, then they don't already have that kind of in their head. I need to answer this a certain way because I'm getting chided by little, yes, you know, data things.
Okay, I'll make a link. I made a Google Doc out of that, so I'll put a link to that so that teachers can have it. Okay. Okay, great. So then at this point, students are sort of are asked what policies have shaped their own choices and access. You know, if they live in a place that is surrounded by fast food restaurants, because those are zoning decisions that somebody has made along the way. What neighborhoods have freeways going through them, what neighborhoods don't, what neighborhoods have green spaces, what don't. It's a great place to jump off and talk about food deserts, which is a, you know, who has access to good food and who doesn't, and what sorts of policies have made that as it is. So then after that, the next part of the question is sort of the summative discussion is, what policies would you create? So if you have been impacted by these sorts of policies over time, to think about what policies have you been impacted, how have they impacted you? And then if you are in the position of making policies for other people, what would you create? How would you make equitable access to all groups of people? So we see how policy created inequities in the story of the Achamal Acham, but how can policies be used to create more equitable environments? And these were going back to the enduring understandings for this lesson. And I want to really focus on the last bullet point there, which is health outcomes are commonly reported using racial or ethnic group labels. And interpreting these sorts of data requires an understanding of complex non-genetic factors that affect groups, as well as diversity within the group. So we come back to this at the end and look at the rates of diagnosed diabetes. And at the beginning, students were asked, do they think that if this is mostly due to genetic or environmental reasons? And if they said genetic at the beginning, hopefully that will have moved a little bit along the spectrum, so that they see that these differences have nothing to do with genetics, but really to environmental impacts on groups of people, and in ways that we've just seen through this lesson. I wanted to mention that in a survey in 2018, 23andMe did a survey, and 52% of the respondents said that biology totally or somewhat determines your racial identity. So if people are believing that, then the flip side, that your racial identity determines your biology, would also be true. So I feel like that's sort of misinterpreted, and at worst it reinforces racial stereotypes and biases that people think are built on genetics, and they're not built on genetics. They're built on differences in environment and which has been created through policies over time. And just to reinforce what Dr. Warren said in the video, is that people who don't have access to healthier choices are the people in populations who are suffering the most from diabetes. And also says, I don't look at diabetes as a medical issue, but as a social justice issue. It's a physical manifestation of colonization. It's preventable, but it requires systemic approaches, including things like food sovereignty and policy. So the take-home messages are that changes in environment impact your risk for type 2 diabetes, and the Pima Indian graph and story provide evidence for this. Public policies play an important role in the environment through zoning and things. And there are a lot of environmental factors that impact personal choice. And the view that type 2 diabetes is caused wholly by an individual's actions does not account for the public policies and structures that shape individual choice. And then last thing, I think this lesson would be nicely wrapped up with a land acknowledgement. Like we did not do one at the beginning, but this is a nice segue into thinking about, well, whose land are you on, and what policies have impacted the places and people in your community. And there's a great website where you can look that up. I was in Spokane not too long ago, and along the Spokane Falls, there's this wonderful sign about the impact of the Grand Coulee Dam on the local Spokane Indian tribes. And on here it says each day during harvest they would harvest 1,000 fish with an average weight of 30 pounds. And so that was the entire economy of a number of tribes who would travel from long distances to come and trade. And when the dams went up, it just wiped all of that out. So there are local ways that you can bring this into your classroom to not just think about the Southwest Indian tribes, but also your own local native inhabitants and indigenous people on the land that we are all inhabiting. So that is the lesson. I keep saying like any questions, but maybe a better question would be, do you teach this sort of thing? I know most of you biology teachers? Do you find a place to teach it or a way to teach these sorts of?
Well, I also teach, I'm also a CTE teacher for health sciences and have currently a health sciences introductory class, and that offers a good chance to go into that direction a little. We have a separate anatomy class, so I don't want to overlap too much with that, but this racial disparity is a big thing right now. I just today showed this, yeah, it can start from day one of your life, like this new 900% rise in syphilis infections and different theme now, but it's becoming a big issue in my classes. It's just kind of getting this awareness out there.
Yeah. And then I teach culinary arts, and we do nutrition and wellness, and we have the opportunity to work with the Muckleshoot tribe quite a bit. And so we've had lots and lots of conversations, and it's very enlightening. The kids have a lot more knowledge than what they realize.
Where are you at?
Federal Way High School.
Where is that? Yes.
South of Seattle, about 20 miles south of Seattle.
Hi. Well, I'm on the East Coast. I'm in the same thing. I CTE, health science. So I do teach anatomy, which is a separate class, and then I teach health science too, which is like a intro to health professions, where we do go over some of this, what we have. I'm in Florida, so it's a little difficult sometimes, but Black History Month, we went over different things related to Black History Month, HeLa cells. So Women's History Month. So this month we're going over, birth control studies in Puerto Rico. So I get to put those things into my health professions class, and I get to get different physicians and different specialties to come in and kind of connect some things that we talked about as far as social and health disparities and how that connects to the kind of healthcare we're able to deliver.
Perfect. That sounds like an amazing class. Like you're able to weave in a lot of really cool things. If I had to do it all over again, that's the kind of class I'd want to teach. I did biology, but the FCS classes really seem rich for a lot of sort of interdisciplinary pieces. Does anybody feel like nervous or like would be worried about putting this out there in some ways, or potential backlash? Or
I was in the beginning when I first mentioned about, we live on the West Coast. Why do I talk about the South and health access there? But the response was pretty, I'm sometimes asked, what surprised you? Oh, I was very surprised to learn that. That's interesting. And I think they want to know about that. It's more reality around us, more relevant, not just these, biology class. I teach pearl after pearl of science facts, but it's often not relevant.
Yeah. Well, with the PIMA study, I mean, it is a group of people, like we're in Seattle, so it's not our local folks, but we're all on indigenous land. So every, I think, local tribe has a similar story. And if you're in the Seattle area, to talk about the damming of the Columbia is its own story. Very similar. You know, once the salmon couldn't be taken, then they all got put on reservations and also given government the commodities food. So the PIMA study is interesting because it's been so well documented over years as far as diabetes goes.
I was just wondering, do you have resources to that, to the more local things, the damming of the Columbia and all that? I can Google it, I guess, but that would be interesting.
No, the sign I just shared is from Spokane, and we were driving through Kettle Falls recently, and so I pulled up Kettle Falls on Wikipedia and was astonished by the thousands of pounds of salmon that came out of there every day. Daily, literally every day, and how people would spend 4 to 6 months a year trading, and it was their source of money. It was their currency. And elsewhere in the 2 video clips that we saw were from the video called Unnatural Causes, which if you can get a hold of it, it's a really powerful video series. And they have one called Health and Wealth, or Health Equaling Wealth. I can't, anyway, it's Unnatural Causes. Is our wealth making us sick? I will get the actual name for you, but they talk about what would our culture be like if suddenly currency, the dollar, if our money currency that we use for everything that we attribute, that we are able to barter and use to do anything, if suddenly that were gone, if you just, money suddenly didn't matter, how would you exist? How would you buy things? How would you trade things? What would happen to your economy? And that's what happened for a lot of the indigenous native tribes.
Okay. That might be an interesting lesson to do, I imagine.
And I think it's interesting how fast you can go from mass starvation and famine to, type 2 diabetes. And it just really highlights a lot of the foods that are shelf stable, that can be shipped across the country, last on a shelf for an extended period of time, that those are cheap because, they're kind of the leftovers, or they are engineered to have a long shelf life. And the health element of them are not taken into consideration. And I don't think fry bread is the only example of a unhealthy food that is made using what is kind of the leftovers from kind of the upper class in the society. And I think America has a lot of examples of those. And it's one of those things where both my parents are food scientists. And when I talk about this with them, they're like, well, would you prefer that they starve, or would you prefer that we can provide these high caloric, high shelf life foods? And that the people making those decisions weren't really even thinking about it. They were probably just like, well, this is what we got, let's ship it to them. All right, great, we did it, done. And not fully grasping the unintended consequences of these decisions that are made from not the people that are impacted by the decisions being made. Just how complex this kind of choice, access, and policy is, when the people that get to decide the policy aren't the people that have to ultimately make the choices in that group.
Well said. Did this answer the question? At the end of the last session, we were talking about this idea that genes determining health traits. And I said, oh, well, we'll get to that in the next session, where we tell the story where you realize how the environment is much more impactful factor in the food environment. Does that put it in perspective? Did that answer that question or the thought?
Very much.
Okay. All right.
Great.
Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Special kudos to you East Coast teachers. Way to go.
Thank
And-
you.
So thanks. And then next week is less environment and more just sharing the culinary macromolecules lessons that have been built for that would work for biology or culinary teachers, but that will be more of a sort of a web crawl through that resource. So,
and we're always available if you have questions, comments, or are looking for resources. I think I dropped the analog version of the environmental survey in the chat. If you need anything modified ever, just let us know. We're happy to jump in and help you out in whatever way we can.
all right. Thanks a lot.